In this video, we're talking about design patterns in React once again. And this time, I want to focus on the single responsibility principle, which is one of the foundational concepts of the solid principles. The single responsibility principle, or SRP for short, is not just some fancy term that we throw around without really meaning anything. It's actually something that will help turn your React components from a terrifying super component that literally tries to do everything to a component that is a lot smaller, a lot easier to manage, and also reusable. By the end of this video, you'll know everything that you need to know about the single responsibility principle in React. You'll also understand why it's important to use it to really build scalable and manageable React codebases. And we're also going to look at an example of a component that doesn't follow the single responsibility principle and how we can refactor it to make sure that it conforms. So get ready, get excited. You are going to learn a lot in this video. All right, let's begin. What is the single responsibility principle and how does it apply to React components? The single responsibility principle states that a component should have one and only one reason to change. In other words, it should only do one thing. It should only be responsible for a single thing. In React, if you build your components following this principle, you actually get a lot of benefits. The first benefit that you would get is you have reduced complexity. By dividing your components into smaller, more focused parts, it makes it easier to understand and manage your code. And this is really important. Whenever you have a React code base, you want to make sure that it's easier to understand and to manage so that you can onboard new developers and bring them up to speed to the project very quickly. You also have enhanced reusability. When components are focused on a single task, they can easily be reused across your application and even across different projects. I do this quite a lot. I make all of my components super simple, super reusable, and I can easily use them across my entire application. And I even have some components that I use across different projects. It also facilitates testing, right? Smaller components with a single responsibility are much easier to test because you have fewer cases to consider. If you have a component that only does one thing, you just have to write 1, 2, or 3 tests that make sure that it does that one thing correctly. And also, it helps improve the maintainability of the code base and of the project. And then when you have bugs, and trust me, you are going to have bugs, it's kind of inevitable to get bugs in a React application, you will be able to pinpoint the issues much faster because your code is well organized. If you have one of those bugs that is really difficult to reproduce, it only happens in specific use cases, if your code is well organized, it's made up of multiple small components, you can find the actual components that are related or at least close to where the bug is happening, and chances are that's where the bug is going to be, right? This helps a lot with that. So in summary, the single responsibility principle is actually quite simple. Just build your React components with a single responsibility in mind. And as soon as you need to add something else to a component, just create a new component instead and combine them together. And then build your application following that principle. So now let's put this into action and look at a component that violates the single responsibility principle and then refactor it to make sure that it conforms. This is the products page component, and as the name implies, it is the component that renders the page where we show the actual products. This component violates the principle because it does a lot of different things. So let's look at some of those parts and see exactly what this component is trying to do. So first, we have this piece of code here, which actually fetches the products from this fake store API, and this is doing it using the useQuery hook from React Query. It's setting the query key manually, it's creating and implementing the query function directly in this component, and then it's also accessing the data, it's fetching and error properties that you get from React Query. Then in the actual JSX, we have an H1 tag that says products page, right? Simple enough. Then if is fetching is true, we're actually showing this loading paragraph here. If error is true, so if we have an error, we're rendering a paragraph that says something went wrong. And then if we have a product, actually if we have multiple products, we are mapping over the products and rendering out each individual product with this piece of code right here. So this component is violating the single responsibility principle. Now, before we actually start refactoring this to make sure that it conforms, let's first define what the single responsibility of the products page is, because it may not be that obvious. To me, this is a page component, right? It has page in the name. It is the component that renders the products page. And as a page component, its responsibility should be to take all of the different pieces of code across the entire code base and put them together, arrange them together in such a way that it can render its actual contents, that it can render the actual products that we want to see in our UI. That's its responsibility. However, it is not responsible for actually implementing each of those individual parts. This component should only take those parts that are already there, they're already created and managed by other components or other hooks, and it should just take them, put them together, arrange them, and then use them to actually display the content that it should display. So now we're going to refactor this component, keeping that responsibility in mind. And let's first start with this piece of code right here, where we're actually fetching the products. The first thing to know is that we actually need to fetch the products inside of this component right here. We need access to the products to be able to display them in our UI. But we actually don't need to implement the fetch the way that we get those products in this component right here. So we don't need to use this useQuery hook inside of this component. Even worse, we shouldn't set the query key of products in this component, and we shouldn't have to define our own query function in this component as well. If we want to follow the single responsibility principle, we should actually extract this entire thing in a custom hook and use that in this component instead. So let's actually do that. Let's come here to our sidebar. Let's create a new folder for hooks. We're going to call this hooks. And inside of here, we're going to create a new file and we're going to call this use fetch products.ts. I'm going to create here a custom hook, export const use fetch products. And I'm going to come back here to the products page component. And I'm going to take all of this use query code here and move it over to the other custom hook. So I'm going to come here, paste it, and I just have to import all of the things that I'm missing. So that's use query. And also we have to import the product type. And then I'm just going to return the use query hook like so. I'm going to do return use query and save. This will allow the products page component to use this custom hook instead, which actually returns the same thing as we had it before, but now it's extracted in a custom hook. And this custom hook also, by the way, follows the single responsibility principle. It only does one thing. Its only responsibility is to actually implement the fetching of the products, which means setting the query key, which means setting the query function, and being reusable enough that if we have any other component in our application that also needs to fetch the products, it can use this custom hook instead. Now, I do want to mention that technically this custom hook is doing two things. It is managing the actual fetch of the products, but it's also defining the function that makes that fetch, this fetch function here. Ideally, this should be separated into another place, perhaps an API folder, so that you can really keep the single responsibility principle. And actually, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move this here and I'm going to create my own function. I'm going to call this const fetch products. And this is going to be an asynchronous function. And let's see if I can just paste this code here, return like this. There we go. And now I can take this and just give it directly to the query function products, so that now we have a further separation of concerns. This fetch products function is only doing one thing. It's implementing the actual fetch, and then we're combining it in this custom hook. This is correct. Although in a real world application, you might move this into a different folder. I'm not going to do it now just because I'm lazy, but I will put a comment here to do move to API folder or equivalent, just so that it's clear that this doesn't really belong here because this is a custom hook file. And then we can come back to our products page component and get rid of all of this code here and replace it with our custom hook. So I'm going to import use fetch products and call it like so. And now this part is conforming to the single responsibility principle because we're not actually implementing the fetch. We're just using the piece that has been implemented elsewhere. Now let's move on to the second part, which is this part right here, line 21 and 22. Is fetching an error. What we're doing is, yes, this products page has the responsibility to decide that it wants to render something else when is fetching is true, and that it wants to render something when there's an error. However, it's not its responsibility to actually implement the UI for those states, for the loading and error states. That implementation for both of these should go to separate components so that we conform to the principle. So let's do that. Let's refactor it. Let's come here. Let's make a new folder called components. And inside of here, we're going to make two components. The first one is going to be loading display.tsx, and I'm just going to create the component export default function loading display, and I'm going to let Copilot be helpful and complete it for me. And then I'm going to create the second component, error display.tsx, and I'm going to do export default function. Let's see, Copilot error display, and like so. And then I'm going to put return something went wrong. And then I'm going to go back to products page, and instead of actually implementing the UI for isFetching and error, I'm going to use those components instead. So come here, import loading display like so, and replace error with error display like this. The benefit of doing it this way is that now we have a separate component for the loading, we have a separate component for the error, and if we ever want to reuse these across different places, which honestly we probably will, we can just use those components instead and not have to redefine and re-implement the actual UI. And you might think to yourself, well, why do we have to do that? We created a whole component just for one line of code. The thing that you have to know is that in these videos, in these tutorial videos, I keep things very, very simple. In a real application, you're going to have a lot more than that. Just think of a basic case where you have an error and you want to have a button to try again, to refetch that same request. That button would go inside of this component and not inside of this products page. Same for the loading display, right? You might have some complicated animation, some loading spinner, and you don't want to have to re-implement all of that every single time. You create a custom component for it and just use that instead. And finally, we have this last part right here, which is the products part. If we have products, we render a div, and then we map over the products and render out each individual product. Again, it's not the responsibility of the products page to actually implement the UI for rendering multiple products. Yes, it needs to decide that we want to actually show some products, but it has to defer the actual implementation of the UI logic to a different component. So what I will do is I will come back here and I will create another component. We're going to call this one product list.tsx. Then we're going to do the same thing again, export default function product list. And that is going to take in the same code as we had before. So I'm actually going to copy all of this code, including the div. You'll see why in just a moment. Return, and then paste this right here. Now we have a problem. We actually don't have products defined anywhere. So we actually need to have this product list component take in products as props. So we need to first define our type. So type product list props equals products product. And here we go. Let's get rid of this, import product. And we need to give it here the props products like this, and this should be fine. Now we no longer have any errors. And then in the products page component, we get rid of all of this and we replace it with our new custom component, product list, import this, give it products, and there we go. And already just with this, you can see how much code we actually removed from products page. This component is now super easy to understand, super easy to work with, and super easy to manage. But we're actually not done. We have this product list component, which doesn't follow the single responsibility principle because it renders out the actual products, but it also renders out the UI for a specific product. So this part has to go in another separate component, which we're going to create right now. Let's come back here, create a new file, and we're going to call this product card.tsx. Do the same thing, export default function product card. And this one is going to take the code that we have here, remove this, paste it, return. I just lost that code. Let me just do it again. There we go. And there we go. Put it here, save this. And now again, we also need to give access to this component to product. So we have to define some types. So we'll do type product card props equals, and we're going to do product import product and give it here as its props. Copilot is being very helpful. And now this product card follows the single responsibility principle. It only does one thing. Its only responsibility is to take a product and to render out the actual UI of that product. In the product list, we can remove all of this and we can replace it with our own custom component that we just created. So product card, and then we give it the key and the actual product. And now this product list component also follows the single responsibility principle because it does only one thing. It renders out a list of products and it defers the actual rendering of a specific product to another component. Now, you may be asking yourself why we have this div here, and the reason why we have it is that in a real-world application, you're probably going to have something like this. Class name, you're going to do flex, and then let's say gap 4, right? These are the styles that this component needs to actually render out its products, right? This is the responsibility. These styles, they belong in this component. They don't belong in the parent component, in the product page component, and they also don't belong in the individual product card component because there's no way that you can actually make this work. This is the component that renders a list of products, and these are the styles that it needs to do that. So that's why we have this div. And also, going back to the product card component, one could make the argument that this part right here should be a separate component, which really it should. I just chose not to do it to keep things simple because this is the seller. This is a user. This is no longer a product, right? So we would ideally have a component that renders out a user. Perhaps we could call this the user card. And the reason why you would want to make this into another component is because the user card might use the user avatar component, might do some fancy logic to show the display name of the user. Maybe the display name comes from the first name and the full name and you want to put them together. And all of those things make sense in a separate component to not pollute the responsibilities of this product card component. And now with this, I mean, just look at this component, right? Like this is beautiful. It's very clear what this component does. You know that it fetches the products, then it renders out some loading. If there's a loading, if there's an error, it renders out the error. If you actually have products, it also renders out a list of products. It's super easy to understand. I can give this to any developer that has never seen this before, and they can quickly understand where each thing is and how to actually be productive if they need to make some changes. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more videos just like these, make sure to leave this video a big thumbs up. You can also click here to subscribe, or you can click here to watch a different video of mine that YouTube seems to think that you're really going to enjoy. And with that being said, my name has been Darius Cosden. This is Cosden Solutions. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Ciao, ciao.